if I was to stop someone randomly on the street and ask them what they thought the most important aspect of synthesis was, they would probably tell me to get the hell away from them. But if I were to go to, say, an online forum for synthesizers where this conversation is expected, they'd probably say something along the lines of, it's the oscillators or the filter or whether or not the synthesizer had a VCA. And yeah, they would all be right in different ways. However, I don't think anybody would say the LFO is the most important part of the synthesizer, and that's because it's not. But I do think it's the most underrated and underappreciated, and that is evident by the design choices of hardware synthesizers over the last 2 decades. Let me show you what I mean. So here we have the Prophet XL. I like the synthesizer a lot because it has digital oscillators, but analog filters. And the digital oscillators also include samples that you can load into it. So the doors are blown wide open when you introduce samples into synthesis. And I'll show you. So first, let's look at LFOs. So LFOs, if you're watching this video, you know what they are, but just in case, listen to, well, let's put a little cutoff on that. Now that's more pleasing. LFOs change the sound. They use an oscillator, an additional oscillator, at a low frequency. It's a low frequency oscillator in order to change whatever you want. One of the most obvious examples and common examples is using an LFO to change the pitch of a oscillator. And that's what we're going to do today because it's just really obvious when you hear it. So I'll turn this up. And that subtle vibrato that LFO brings in kind of sounds like a voice. That's very common. And you heard it a lot in the 80s, actually. But when you turn it back up, it can be pretty strong and pretty unruly. And you can also make it faster or slower. And that's typically what an LFO will provide to you on a synthesizer. Now, you can likely send that LFO to change anything. You could change the filter, the cutoff on the filter, or you can change the length of attack on an envelope. But LFOs are great. They're a great way to add movement and flavor into a patch. The problem is with the amount of options they give us in terms of shapes for LFOs. So this is a triangle. That's what we just heard. That's this. There's also, on this one at least, there's a ramp up. So it starts from the lowest point in the oscillator and goes all the way up to the top, and then it drops right back down as an absolute change. There's also ramp down. Self-explanatory. There's also square. It takes the lowest point of an oscillator and the highest point of an oscillator, and there's no ramp up or down. Those are absolute changes. And then you have random on a lot of synthesizers, which is basically the same thing as a square wave, except you don't know where it's going to end. It's going to end up. But you see, it sounds as stepped as a square wave does. And to most, this is enough. Even the random LFO, I think most people go, why would you use that? Well, if you were to, say, speed it up enough and make it subtle enough, you could take something that sounds like this and turn it into something that sounds like this, which sounds a lot more alive. However, I'm not happy with this being all my options. In fact, this is kind of light, especially when you look at the history of LFOs. I find this very frustrating when one of the most popular, iconic synthesizers from the 80s, which was the Roland SH-101, which was a monophonic synthesizer. Simple thing, but it had one thing that most of these synthesizers today don't. It had a noise generator as a modulation source, or as, a truly random LFO. And if you're asking me what's the difference between that and random, well, the random, if you look at the picture, the steps are absolute. There's no ramp up or ramp down. There's no shape to any of the changes. It just goes, it's almost robotic. And noise, especially a noise generator, is the true definition of absolute unpredictability and chaos. If you were to send a filter or a pitch of an oscillator through that modulation source, if you were to allow that modulation source to affect that thing, it truly makes the sound come alive in such an organic way that it makes me angry whenever I don't see it as an option on these new synthesizers. The reason why I brought the Prophet XL out today is because there's a sort of a way to do that with samples. But even then, it's not the same thing because I'm not generating noise, I'm replicating noise. And that means that the predictability of the randomness is left up to the sample itself. But let's try it. So on this synthesizer, there are 4 oscillators. 2 of them are digital analog style oscillators, and 2 of them are sample slots. So let's go into one of the sample slots, and we're going to load up a noise sample. Okay. And if I were to play this now, well, let's actually get rid of the LFO effect so you can truly hear what's going on. You have a sawtooth oscillator that's being filtered out, and you also have a sample of brown noise being played. I'm using brown noise because it favors the low end of the frequency spectrum, and I find that is more pleasant to use as a modulation source. I don't know why. But if I were to, let's say, we're going to turn that sample all the way down, so now I don't hear it anymore, but it's still playing. And we're going to go into the modulation matrix of the Prophet XL. And I love this modulation matrix. It's so open. There's so many sources that you can send to so many destinations. And if you go in here, you can see that the LFO1 is affecting oscillator 1 frequency, which is what we were hearing this whole time. I'm going to go ahead and turn that off. We're not even going to use the LFO. We're going to use the brown noise as a modulation source. And we're going to have it affect all oscillator frequencies. So as I turn this up, you're going to start to hear the character of the brown noise sample being imparted on the oscillator. And that sounds way more organic and chaotic than even the random oscillator. But even this, in the way that it is, has its limits, because the brown noise sample is pitched up and down the keyboard. So the way it's going to affect this note is different than how it will affect this note. If you can hear, the modulations of the pitches are actually faster up here as opposed to down here. So when you play them, they're all on their own timing, which it has its own feeling. However, if you want to get it to sound like it's all being fed through, a really broken tape or something, this is how you do that. So I'm going to go back to instrument 1, and I'm going to turn off key follow. So that means that every time I play a note, I'll actually bring the instrument back up. So every time I play a note, it's hard to hear if you don't have headphones on, but now the pitch of the sample is the same no matter what key I'm playing. As opposed to when I have key follow on, you can hear that down here, it's a lot lower pitched, and so the chaos of the sample is a lot slower. We're going to turn off key follow, and we're actually going to turn the frequency of the sample almost all the way down. and we'll turn the noise sample all the way back down. So now, every single note is going to be affected in the same way. Now it almost sounds like it's being sent through one of those lo-fi pedals or something. And you can make this as crazy as you want. It's all following in the same time. I love that. In fact, you can actually take this as far as you want. You can take piano samples and make them modulation sources for synthesizers. You can take a piano sample, and because you have two instrument slots here, you could take a piano sample and have the brown noise modulate the piano sample, and you can get really tape lo-fi sounding piano sounds. This is the power of broadening the horizons of your modulation sources on a synthesizer. And for most nowadays, it's just going to be your LFOs and stuff like aftertouch and velocity and maybe some other stuff. But the idea of introducing chaos into what is considered otherwise a pretty static tone is such a huge and powerful thing. And I'm just surprised that more companies don't prioritize it as much as I think they should. It would really open up the possibilities for sound design. So anyway, that's it. Drink some water.